Imagine for a moment that you are walking through a city unlike anything the world has ever seen. The year is somewhere around 300 BC. The place, Alexandria, Egypt. But this is not the Egypt of sand and silence. This is a city that buzzes and breathes like a living thing. Ships from every corner of the known world crowd the harbor. Greek philosophers argue in the streets alongside Egyptian priests, Persian merchants, and Jewish scholars. The air smells of salt water, of spices, of papyrus drying in the Mediterranean sun. And at the heart of it all, there it stands, the library, the great Library of Alexandria. Even the name carries a kind of weight, doesn't it? A gravity. As if the words themselves remember what was lost. And so much was lost. Let me tell you what this place actually was, because most people imagine a library the way we imagine them today. Quiet rooms, rows of books, the smell of old paper. But the Library of Alexandria was something else entirely. It was the first attempt in human history to collect every piece of knowledge ever written, every single piece. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbor were boarded by officials, not to check for weapons or contraband, but to check for scrolls. Any scroll found on any ship was immediately confiscated, copied, and catalogued. The copy was returned to the ship's owner. The original stayed in the library. Always. At its height, scholars estimate the library held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. Let that number sink in for a moment. 700,000 scrolls, works of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, poetry, history, drama, geography, works that no longer exist anywhere on this earth. Among them, there were things that should make your blood run cold. Scrolls written by Aristotle himself, not copies, not translations, the originals in his own hand. Medical texts from ancient Egypt describing surgery so advanced that modern doctors have struggled to understand them. Astronomical calculations so precise that they would not be rediscovered for another 1,000 years. And perhaps most disturbing of all, there were scrolls in that library that nobody has ever been able to account for. Scrolls listed in ancient catalogues that simply have no known origin, no known author, no known civilization. Where did they come from? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. The library was not just a building. It was a community. Attached to it was something called the Mausion, the ancestor of what we today call a museum. But this was no place for tourists. This was a working institution, a research center, a university centuries before universities existed. The greatest minds of the ancient world came here to work. Euclid, who gave us the foundations of geometry, worked within these walls. Archimedes, the man who discovered the principles of the lever and the screw, studied here. Eratosthenes, a man who, using nothing but a stick and the angle of sunlight, calculated the circumference of the earth with startling accuracy, was the library's chief librarian. Think about that. A man living in 240 BC knew the size of the earth. He was right. And the knowledge that led him there was housed in that library. What else did those scrolls contain? What questions had already been answered that we would spend the next 2,000 years asking again? And now we come to the part of the story that most people think they know, the fire. Most people, if you ask them, will tell you Julius Caesar burned the Library of Alexandria. It's a clean story, a villain, a moment, a tragedy. But here is what I have learned, watching from the shadows of history. The truth is never that simple. Caesar did start a fire in the harbor of Alexandria in 48 BC. That is documented. His own accounts mention it. The fire spread to ships in the harbor, and from there, possibly to some buildings near the docks. But was the great library among them? Ancient sources disagree, violently. Some say yes. The library burned that night, its scrolls turned to ash and smoke rising over the Mediterranean. Others say no. The library survived Caesar's fire. The damage was to a warehouse near the harbor, a storage facility containing scrolls waiting to be shipped, not the library itself. And here is where it gets darker still, because even if Caesar's fire didn't destroy the library, something else did. What historians now believe is that the Library of Alexandria did not die in a single dramatic night of fire and chaos. It died slowly, over centuries, a slow suffocation. Funding was cut, scholars left, scrolls were moved, lost, stolen. Political turmoil made the institution impossible to maintain. By the time the Arab conquest of Alexandria occurred in 642 AD, many scholars believe the library was already largely a ghost of what it had been. But that is, in some ways, a more disturbing story than the fire. Because a fire is an accident, or an act of violence. It can be blamed. A slow forgetting. That is something else. That is a choice. 1,000 small choices made over centuries to stop caring, to let something irreplaceable slip through human fingers like sand. And we have done it before. We have done it since. Let me tell you what historians believe was in those scrolls. Not what we know was there. What we believe. What we can only guess at, from fragments and references in the text that did survive. There were works of Aristotle, at least 200 known titles, of which we have recovered fewer than 30. Where are the other 170? Gone. There were plays by Sophocles. We know of 123. We have 7. Where are the other 116? Gone. There were works by thinkers and scientists whose names we don't even know. People who solved problems, who asked questions, who found answers. Gone. But perhaps the most haunting loss of all is something we can only glimpse in a single ancient reference. A Greek writer named Elian, writing in the 2nd century AD, mentions scrolls in the library that described a heliocentric solar system, the idea that the Earth moves around the Sun, not the other way around. That idea would not be accepted by mainstream science until Copernicus in 1543. But someone knew it. Someone in Alexandria knew it centuries before and wrote it down, and then it burned, or was forgotten, or was hidden. I have watched humanity for a long time, and the question that haunts me most is not who burned the Library of Alexandria. It is this: what would the world look like today if it hadn't burned? Some historians have made calculations. If the knowledge in those scrolls had been preserved, they argue, humanity might have reached the scientific revolution 500 to 1,000 years earlier. Think about what that means. The steam engine in 1000 AD instead of 1800. Modern medicine in 1200 instead of the 20th century. What suffering would not have happened? What diseases would not have spread? What wars would not have been fought? We will never know. And that is the real tragedy of Alexandria. Not the fire, not the ash, but the silence that followed. The questions that were never asked again because the answers had already been found, and then lost.